Chapter 1. March 1852. Independence, Missouri. Hannah Moseby sat in the parlor of her stepfather's home, quietly doing needlepoint. It was almost time for her stepfather to be home, and she had no desire to see him. The man was absolutely insufferable. Her father had died 2 years previously, and her mother had quickly remarried, though she hadn't needed to financially. They'd had a place to live and plenty of money to spend, but her mother had been lonely without a man in her life. Hannah pitied her mother. She herself had no desire to marry anytime soon. Sure, all of her friends were marrying, because they were of that age. One of her friends was already a widow. Hannah had no desire to follow suit though. She was an independent young woman of 19 years old, and marrying would only put someone in her life who thought they were allowed to do anything they wanted to her. Maybe someday she would marry, but that day would not be soon. Her mother sat beside her, a shadow of the woman she'd once been. Mr. Gatlin had made sure she knew her place within their marriage from day one, and it was a place Hannah never wanted to be. A place of doing what she was told when she was told to do it. No, thank you. Hannah looked up when the door opened, and she saw her mother jerk out of the corner of her eye, as if she was nervous now that Mr. Gatlin was home. Why on earth did she insist on marrying the crazy man if she was afraid of him? It made no sense to Hannah whatsoever. Mr. Gatlin walked into the parlor where they sat, and he took a chair opposite the sofa. Oh, good. You're both here. I want to tell you my good news while we're all together. Mother looked up from her needlework and smiled at her husband, but to Hannah's mind it wasn't a real smile. Not like the smiles she gave Hannah when they were alone, or like the smiles she'd given to Hannah's father. No, this was a fake smile, reserved for her new husband. What good news? I have found a husband for Hannah. She is to marry a pastor tomorrow, and the two of them will leave for Oregon Territory on Monday. Mr. Gatlin looked proud of himself, as if he'd accomplished something Hannah was unable to do for herself. Of course, Hannah hadn't been looking for a man. I'm not ready to marry, Hannah said softly. When I am, I will choose the man for myself. She looked back down at her needlework after the defiant words. She knew that Mr. Gatlin would be angry, and the man's face always turned a splotchy reddish purple when he was angry. She had no desire to see that. You're 19 years old. Of course, you're ready to marry. You do not belong in this house now that you're grown. Hannah frowned, waiting for Mother to say something, anything, that would make the man understand she didn't want or need a husband. But Mother sat quietly with her head down. This was the home she'd grown up in. It had been her father's home. If anyone didn't belong, it was him. I refused to marry a stranger. Make other plans, Mr. Gatlin, Hannah finally said when it was obvious her mother would be of no help to her. I don't think you understand your situation, Hannah. You either marry this stranger, or you find someone else to marry in the next 24 hours. You are no longer a welcome guest in my home, and you will leave. Mr. Gatlin's face wasn't splotchy as it usually was when he was angered. It was downright evil looking. But, this is my father's home. It was never yours. She couldn't stop the words from spilling out of her mouth, though she knew they would anger him. It is my home now, as I've told you repeatedly. The minister is coming for supper tonight, and you will either marry him or find somewhere else to go. Mr. Gatlin got to his feet, obviously very angered by her words. I deserve thanks for finding a man who will happily take you off my hands, not your complaining. You are an ungrateful daughter, and I will be happy to see you go. With those words he left the room, storming off to his office and slamming the door behind him. Hannah looked over at her mother, who was still staring at her embroidery, obviously afraid to say a word. Well, Mother? How are you going to convince him that I shouldn't have to marry the minister he found? She knew her mother would have to be her ally. There was no one else to take her side. Her mother shook her head. I'm afraid I can't intercede on your behalf. By your age, I was married and had a 3-year-old daughter. It's time for you to move out and become your own woman. Mother, you can't actually expect me to go to Oregon. Hannah was actually becoming frightened now that her mother had agreed with her stepfather. How on earth would she be able to cook over a campfire? She knew how to cook over a proper stove, of course, because her mother had spent time teaching her. The servants usually did the cooking, but her mother had told her she needed to have the skill. She could also clean house and sew, but she didn't want to have to do those things. She liked being able to, but having to was something entirely different. Her mother shrugged. I don't really have a choice. My husband has said it must happen, and so it must. She got to her feet. Let's go find a dress suitable for a wedding, and I'll talk to you about what to expect on your wedding night. Her mother blushed slightly as she said the last bit, and Hannah sighed. There was no getting out of this. They looked through Hannah's dresses hanging in the chifforobe in her room, and her mother pulled out a beautiful dress she'd only worn to church one time. It was white and had beautiful sleeves that spread out over her hands. This one, I think. Hannah sighed. Shouldn't I wear black to mourn the life that's being taken away from me? As soon as the words were out of her mouth, she wanted to take them back. This wasn't her mother's decision. It was that man's. You need to be happy about marrying this man. He needs a good wife, and you will be that wife. You won't bring shame on me by acting like you don't want to marry him. Do you understand? Hannah nodded. Yes, Mother. She didn't want to go. She didn't want to be a wife or a mother. And who wanted to travel the Oregon Trail? But there was no choice unless she could find a job as a domestic in town. That was a possibility. It was unthinkable, though. She would be working as a domestic for her peers, and she knew she'd never be able to take orders the way a domestic should. Her mother sat her down on the foot of her bed and sat beside her, pulling the handkerchief she'd always carried from her sleeve. My mother gave me this the night before my wedding. She told me that marriage can be hard on women, but it's also a blessing. The handkerchief is to remind me that even if I cry some tears, I will always be blessed in my marriage. She held it out to Hannah. I want you to have it. Hannah hesitated for a moment before taking the object from her mother. I will always treasure your hanky, Mother. Always. Her mother smiled. Good. Now, let's talk about what will occur on your wedding night. It's how babies are made. Hannah was horrified as her mother told her exactly what would happen between her and her husband in her marriage bed. I don't want to do that. Don't worry. If you don't like it, you can just close your eyes and plan your meals for the week. It'll be over before you know it. But I'm not ready for children. You have no choice now that you're marrying. One of the most sacred things a woman can do is bear children. It was what God intended for us. I always wanted more than just you, but God didn't provide them for me. Her mother looked sad. Hannah took a deep breath. I'll do everything I can to be a good wife. Inside she knew she wasn't telling the whole truth. She'd never been good about obedience. Oh, she did as she was told the majority of the time, but she did so with complaint more often than not. Her mother put her arm around Hannah and rested her head against hers. I know you will. After a moment of sitting that way together, Mother got to her feet and said, we need to get your things ready for your journey. You probably need to only take 1 or 2 dresses. Hannah frowned. I believe I should take them all. If we need something to trade along the trail, my dresses will work well. Truthfully, she just wanted to be well-dressed as she always had been. They could probably trade 1 or 2 of her dresses if there was a dire emergency. Her mother nodded, looking at all the dresses her daughter had. She even had the dresses that she'd worn as a child hanging beside the ones she wore to parties and church. We need to get started then. I'll go fetch a trunk from my room. While her mother was gone, Hannah frowned. Would this be the last thing she and her mother did together? Packing up her clothing for an arduous journey that many didn't survive? She straightened herself up and began taking her dresses down. She would make it. She had to. Asterisk. Jedediah Scott knocked on the door of the house he'd been told to go to for supper. He'd met a man earlier that day, as he was buying things for his trip on the Oregon Trail, who had told him he shouldn't go west alone, because there weren't a lot of women out west. He should instead marry the man's stepdaughter. It seemed very odd to him, but he was more than willing. It wouldn't be easy to be a pastor out west with no wife. He was nervous as he waited for someone to come to the door. He wasn't sure he would be interested in the woman, but he hoped he would. Of course, it seemed like Providence that he'd been approached by a man in the local general store, so he would follow along. If God wanted him married to her, then he would marry her. He couldn't remember her name, but he was sure he'd been told what it was. After what seemed an inordinate amount of time, the man he'd met earlier came to the door. I don't know what happened to my wife and daughter. They usually come to the door. Excuse their tardiness, Pastor. It's no problem at all, Jedediah said with a smile. He had been invited to eat supper with this family and meet his future bride. He was looking forward to a good meal, but nervous about meeting the future wife. He hoped she wasn't too terribly homely, but even if she was, it was his job to do as God wanted him to do. Come sit in the parlor for a moment while I find my wife and daughter. Jedediah saw that the man looked very angry about something, but he couldn't imagine what it might be. When Mr. Gatlin returned, it was with a woman who must be in her 30s. She was pretty in a quiet way. He was certain this must be the woman he was meant to marry. So be it. It's so nice to meet you, Jedediah said, nodding politely to the woman. Mr. Gatlin gave him a strange look. This is my wife, he said. My stepdaughter will be down in a moment. The two ladies were in a frenzy of packing, so I told Hannah she needed to tidy her appearance before meeting you. I see. Jedediah looked at the woman in front of him, whom he would have found perfectly acceptable as a wife. He had no idea what to say to her. I don't know your name, Pastor, she said softly, and her husband gave her a glaring look. I'm Jedediah Scott. I just finished my schooling to become a minister. Are you traveling the Mormon Trail? The woman asked, calmly. No, I'll be traveling to Oregon. I don't know yet where God wants me, but I know it's not in the Salt Lake Valley. I'm not Mormon. The woman looked relieved by his words. You weren't hoping I was a Mormon? Not at all. I was hoping you weren't. I cannot imagine Hannah being married to a man she had to share with another wife. Jedediah smiled. Well, there's no worry of that at the moment. I'm glad to hear it. She smiled slightly, looking at her husband with worry. A young woman came down the stairs then, more of an age that he had expected for his bride. She walked slowly, but she seemed to be dragging herself, as if she didn't want this wedding that her stepfather had assured him she would be in favor of. She stopped in front of him and inclined her head slightly, waiting for something, though he had no idea what it could be. He understood when her stepfather made the introduction. Mr. Scott, this is my stepdaughter, Hannah. Jedediah smiled. I'm Jedediah, he said softly. It's very nice to meet you, Hannah. He was pleased that she wasn't pretty. He knew that sounded strange, but with her red hair and freckles, she seemed to be only of average looks. He hadn't wanted a beauty for a wife, and he certainly wasn't getting one. She was pleasant enough to look at though. And you, she said softly, obviously knowing it was what she must say. Perhaps we could have a few moments to talk, Jedediah said. With the door open, of course. Mr. and Mrs. Gatlin nodded, smiling at him. I think that would be just fine, Mr. Gatlin said, following his meek little wife from the room. Jedediah waited for Hannah to sit down on the sofa, across from where he was sitting. I know this marriage is a surprise to you. I thought we could spend a few minutes getting to know one another better before the wedding tomorrow. He had to know she really wanted the marriage as he did. Hannah nodded. I've recently become a pastor. I plan to go west and be minister to one of the underserved areas of the country. I enjoy being outdoors, and I'm looking forward to the long trek to Oregon. Hannah blinked a couple of times. You mean the long wagon ride? She asked. We are taking a wagon? He nodded. Yes, one of us will drive the wagon, while the other walks beside it. I'm not sure you're strong enough to drive a team of oxen. Have you ever driven a wagon? She shook her head. No, I haven't, but I'm certain that I could if I was allowed to. He smiled. I like your attitude. I'll teach you to drive on our first day of the trek. Really? She asked. You won't mind if I drive? You don't think it's men's work? I don't think God cares which one of us drives the wagon, and which one of us walks beside it. He shrugged. I don't know why he would. Then I would definitely like to learn to drive it. Sounds good to me. I wasn't looking forward to that aspect of the journey. Jedediah smiled. Your stepfather seemed eager to set us up with one another. Have you not met anyone else suitable? The girl wasn't ugly, but she wasn't someone he would call pretty. She did have a nice shape and the dress she wore was pretty. I haven't tried to meet a suitable man. I thought I could stay here and grow old. My stepfather told me that's not an option. Hannah looked straight at him as she spoke, and he felt sorry for her. You don't have to marry me if you don't want to. I've been told I marry you or someone else. I'm not allowed to live here any longer. There was no bitterness in her voice, but he sensed she was upset by the revelation she'd just received. Then marry me. I won't demand my marital rights until you're ready for them, and we will be a team working together to reach Oregon and all the wonders it has. He shrugged. I want to be a pastor and a farmer, I think. My father was a farmer, and if I hadn't received God's call, I'd be helping him still. The farm would have been mine to inherit one day, but I have convinced him to leave everything to my younger brother. You'd wait on the marriage bed? My mother told me that men enjoy the act a great deal. I hope women enjoy it as well, but I know that's not always the case. I will wait until you feel comfortable with me and ready. She smiled. Thank you. I don't think you'll be a terrible husband after all. He had no idea what she'd been told about him by her stepfather, but he hoped he hadn't been painted too badly. He wanted her for his bride, but more importantly, he wanted her to want to be his bride. I will do my best to not be terrible, he said softly. He stood up, offering her his arm. May I escort you into supper? He could tell she was a lady who was used to having men fawn over her. He wasn't going to be good at the whole fawning thing, but he was certain he could at least pretend to be a gentleman for a little while. Her parents were waiting at the dining room table, and he pulled out a chair for her. He knew she was capable of doing it on her own, but it was a nice gesture, and one he thought she'd like. God knew once they started their journey, it would be hard to observe the niceties of society. Mr. Gatlin waited until they were seated before asking, Did you get to know one another? I believe that will take the rest of our lives, Jedediah said, but we did some preliminary work on the matter. Hannah smiled slightly. I will marry this man with no complaints. Her stepfather looked at her in surprise for a moment. You will? Yes, I will. Good then. I hope the two of you have a wonderful life together. Mr. Gatlin looked down the table at his wife. What time would you like the wedding to be tomorrow? Mrs. Gatlin took a sip of the water in front of her. I believe I would like a late afternoon wedding, if that suits the bride and groom. Jedediah nodded. That sounds good. I will need to spend the morning getting my wagon loaded for the trip. And I'll need to spend the morning packing up my things. Hannah looked at her mother. Do I have any dresses suitable for the trail? Her mother pursed her lips. Maybe one or two. I'll make sure you have some before you leave, even if we have to buy them from the general store. Jedediah frowned. It hadn't occurred to him that she might need clothes for the trail. We're starting soon. Be sure you have plenty of winter clothes. I want to be nicely settled in Oregon before winter arrives, so we're leaving soon. Our wagon train will only be 22 wagons, and we're starting on Monday, the 29th Sept/Sep of March. That's early in the year. That's fine, Mrs. Gatlin said. I'll make certain she's ready. Let's plan to meet at 4 tomorrow afternoon at the church. All right. I'll be there. Through the rest of the meal, Mr. Gatlin commandeered the conversation, and they talked about the perils of the trail. He kept emphasizing Indian attacks, but from Jedediah's information, the real killer was cholera. He didn't argue with the pompous man, though. He seemed to think he knew everything about the trail, simply because he lived in Independence. After supper, he needed to leave right away. I feel funny leaving my wagon as long as I have. One of the other men on our wagon train, Joseph Mitchell, is watching over it, but he has 2 wagons and 8 children to watch over. I can't take advantage of his time on the trail for too long. Hannah got up to walk him to the door. Thank you for coming this evening. Getting a chance to talk to you before the wedding was something I really needed. I can understand that. This whole thing is rushed. He smiled at her. I'll see you tomorrow afternoon. After the wedding, we'll stop here and collect your things. Already, he was thinking about the extra blanket and pillow he needed to buy for a lady. Hopefully she would have those things to bring, but her stepfather seemed to be a singularly unpleasant man. He may not be willing to spare anything from his household. I hope you have a nice evening. With one last smile, she closed the door, and he smiled to himself. In a way, he felt like he was rescuing her from a difficult situation. All would be well. God wouldn't have led him to her otherwise. Hannah slowly closed the door after him and leaned back against it, letting out a sigh of relief. It sounded to her as if Jedediah would be a good husband. The Oregon Trail wasn't something she wanted to travel, but hopefully it wouldn't be a horrific experience. When she got upstairs to her room, her mother was already there, working on packing up her things. Hannah moved beside her and worked alongside her. I bought myself a journal when I first married so I would be able to record everything about marriage and how wonderful it was. But you came along so quickly that I didn't ever write in it. I thought you might enjoy having it for your journey out west. Mother placed a beautiful bound book in her hands. As she flipped through the pages, she saw that it was completely blank. Thank you, Mother. I think this will be good. Hannah had always enjoyed writing down private thoughts and little details about her daily life. She looked forward to writing down everything that happened on the trail. It would be such a wondrous journey that she was secretly excited about the time she'd spend on the road. Especially now that she knew she wouldn't have to walk. Knowing that Jedediah was a good man made everything simpler. She didn't have to worry about him turning into Mr. Gatlin. At least she hoped she didn't. She put the journal on her dresser, planning to begin writing in it the very next night. The entire story of her journey overland would be available for all posterity. It made her feel good to know that the things she did could shape the future for others. Why, someday, they may even use steam engines to go from one end of the country to the other, but that was a long way down the road. That night, as she put on her nightgown and braided her hair preparing for bed, she couldn't help but think about Jedediah, wondering where their lives would lead. Would she be the mother of a whole bevy of children? Or would she spend her life by his side as simply a partner and not a love? She had no idea, but she liked that her life was now full of possibilities that it hadn't been full of even a day ago. Maybe Mr. Gatlin was doing her a service, instead of forcing her into life of servitude as a wife. Only time would tell. Asterisk. When Jedediah got back to camp, he walked over to talk to Captain George Bedwell, their wagon master. He had made the journey the previous year and found the area he wanted to settle in. He had come back for his wife and children, and all of them would be traveling together. His 2 boys, Harvey and Albert, were in their early teens, and they were very excited about the journey ahead of them. "I just wanted to let you know that I'll be getting married tomorrow afternoon, so there will be one more on the trail with me." Captain Bidwell nodded. "That sounds like a good plan. You'll be happy to have someone cooking your suppers in the evenings." "I know that's true. She'll be here with me starting tomorrow night. Make sure she knows to bring warm clothes. Starting out this early in the year is going to make things just a tad bit more difficult on the beginning of the trail, but so much better at the end. I think we'll be glad we did it." "I'm sure we will. I look forward to our travels." Jedediah walked back toward his wagon, saying a silent prayer as he walked, thanking God for Hannah and for her willingness to make the journey with him. He knew he was in for the adventure of his life. Chapter 2. When Hannah woke the following morning, she was both anxious and excited. Being out from under Mr. Gatlin's rule would help her a great deal, but it was more than that. She was actually looking forward to going adventuring with Jedediah. Once she'd met him, she knew he was a good man, and he was much younger than any preacher she had ever met. Why, she was certain they would get along like 2 long-lost friends. She could already tell. She spent the morning finishing the packing of her room with her mother at her side, and she found herself talking excitedly about Jedediah and the future she was sure they would hold. "Mother, he said we could be partners in life, and I didn't have to do, well, that thing you told me about right away." Her mother gave her a surprised look. "He did?" Hannah nodded as she carefully folded a blanket to take with her. She would take all of her bedding because her parents could always buy more. She had a feeling she and Jedediah would be having to be more careful with their funds. "He did. I really like him, Mother. Who would have thought that Mr. Gatlin would actually find me a man I wanted to spend time with? I think we'll start out as friends, and after 3 or 4 years, maybe we'll actually fall in love. Then we can have children. I don't want to have a baby when I'm still a baby myself." Her mother laughed and shook her head. "Despite the fact that you'll always be my baby, you're definitely old enough for marriage and children. I'll expect to get letters whenever you can send them." It wasn't until then that it struck Hannah that she would be without her mother for the first time in her life. "I think you should come with me." Mother frowned. "You know I can't do that. I'm married, and my husband is here. Besides, the pastor will not want his mother-in-law on the trail with him. I know you don't love Mr. Gatlin." "No one could." "That's not very respectful, Hannah. You're not going to be able to get away with saying things like that once you're married, you know." Hannah made a face. "I think Jedediah and I understand each other. No man of God is going to understand you disrespecting your parents." "I don't disrespect you. Just him." Hannah sighed, wishing she understood why on earth her mother had married Mr. Gatlin in the first place. He was over 50 and just plain mean-spirited. Unless he was in front of other Christians, and then he was a very pious man. It made her a bit sick to her stomach. "Just be careful, Hannah. I've let you get away with disobedience to me over the years. Please don't be the same with your husband." "I won't." Hannah wasn't sure what it would be like to be married, but she was sure she'd have an equal say in all decisions. Jedediah would come to her. There was no reason for him not to. An hour before they needed to leave for the church, Hannah's mother helped her change into the beautiful off-white dress they'd chosen for her to marry in. Her trunks were next to each other. Mother had helped convince her to only take 2 trunks instead of the 4 she wanted to take, but it had meant a lot of paring down to get to that number. Hannah's red hair was fixed high atop her head, wound into a beautiful bun. I wish I had blonde hair. Or brunette even. I just hate being a redhead. Her mother smiled. Your hair is the exact same color your father's was. I saw his red hair in church one Sunday morning when I was about 12. I pointed to him and said, I'm going to marry that man one day. My mother just smiled, but I was married 3 years later. I so miss your father. I do too. It seems like forever since the day he hugged me goodbye and never came home. Hannah felt a tear drift down her cheek. I wish he was here to give me away today. I do too. But Mr. Gatlin is planning to give you away, and you need to be kind to him. Hannah sighed. I will. But inside I'll be wishing it was father. So will I, her mother said as she pressed a kiss on Hannah's forehead. We need to head downstairs now. He'll be waiting out front to drive us to the church. Hannah looked at her room, now bare of her possessions. It didn't look or feel like the same place she'd lived her entire life. It was too empty. I'll miss living in this little room and knowing you are just down the hall. That if I cried out, you'd hear me and come running. I'll miss you so much, Hannah. You've been a daughter and a friend. I love you. I love you too. Together, they walked down the stairs and outside to get in the wagon. Jedediah had told her they'd come by after the wedding to pick up her belongings. Her stepfather helped her into the buggy, and then he helped her mother. I'm escorting the 2 most beautiful women in town today, he said loudly, so passers-by would hear him and look at him. The man would do anything for attention. Hannah was surprised he hadn't had a banner made announcing she was finally marrying. He drove through the crowded streets of Independence toward the church where Hannah's mother had married both of her husbands, and where Hannah herself had been baptized. When Mr. Gatlin stopped in front of the church, Hannah waited for him to help her down from the buggy, knowing he would feel the need to do so in public. If there was no one around, he told her she didn't need help. The 3 of them walked into the church, presenting a picture of a united family, though they were anything but in Hannah's mind. Jedediah was waiting at the front of the church, and she smiled as she loosely put her hand on Mr. Gatlin's arm, wishing she didn't have to touch him. The pastor she'd had since she was a small girl was the one who married them, and when it came time for Jedediah to kiss her to seal the marriage, she lifted her face up to his, a bit startled. She'd forgotten about the kiss, and she'd never been kissed before. She heard her mother weeping in the front row, and she wished she knew how to calm her, when her own heart was trying to beat its way out of her chest. Jedediah leaned down and briefly brushed his lips against hers, and she blushed, feeling strangely. His kiss had made her stomach tie itself in knots, but there was a short-lived fluttery feeling that she rather enjoyed. She turned to face her mother and stepfather and a few other people her stepfather had talked into attending the wedding. She didn't know them, and she truly didn't much care that they were there. It was strange, but she had no desire to be around people that day. She just wanted her mother and Jedediah. Hannah smiled at her new husband before heading toward her mother, who was still wiping away tears. She pulled the hanky her mother had given her from her sleeve. This will help dry your tears, mother. When her mother saw the hanky, she cried even harder. Mr. Gatlin was looking at his wife as if she'd just grown 2 heads. She's married. I thought you'd be happy now. I am happy, her mother wailed, crying even harder. When her mother didn't take the hanky, she carefully tucked it back into her sleeve, wondering what to do about her mother, who was weeping and wailing as if she was job and had just lost all of her family at once. Perhaps if we go somewhere more private, Mr. Gatlin. Hannah looked around and was very aware of the gaze of every person in the church. Mr. Gatlin nodded curtly and got to his feet, leading her mother out by one arm. "Please stop making such a scene." Her mother only wailed louder at the words, and Hannah hid a giggle as she looked at the confused expression on Jedediah's face. "Mother never makes a scene. Ever. This is the first time I've seen her cry in public. Even at my father's funeral, she remained completely stoic." "Does she not approve of me as a husband for you?" Jedediah asked. "She does, I think. But truthfully, she spent very little time with you. She'll need a little while to adjust." He frowned. "We leave on Monday. That's only 3 days from now. She'll be fine by then. At least I think she will. I will write often, and she won't even realize I'm gone." Hannah had always been particularly close to her mother, and she knew deep inside that her leaving would leave her mother bereft. "I'm going to the campground to get my wagon so we can pick up your trunk. Do you want to walk over and ride back with me? It might be best if we leave your mother alone with Mr. Gatlin to calm her down." Hannah nodded. "I'd like the walk." Mr. Gatlin had always tried to get her to stay inside and never venture out. He talked about how ugly freckles made her, and she was more prone to freckles than most because of her red hair. "Let's go then," he said, walking toward the campground just outside of town with her. She looked over her shoulder to watch Mr. Gatlin trying to help her still crying mother into the family buggy. She wanted to laugh hysterically, but she wasn't sure how her new husband would react. She couldn't stop her lips from twitching though. "You're amused?" Hannah nodded. "Mr. Gatlin has no idea how to deal with my mother. He leaves every morning, and she tells me what's on her mind and we talk through it. He's not going to know what to do with her without me there acting as a buffer." "Well, those letters will be fun to read, won't they?" She nodded. "They certainly will." As they walked toward the camp, he told her what he'd done already to prepare for the journey. "I'd already purchased all of the supplies recommended for one person on the trail, but your stepfather gave me enough money to pay for a second person. So, I got everything for you. You have a trunk packed already, right?" She nodded. "Actually, I have 2 trunks packed. I packed all of my dresses, because most have only been worn once or twice. I thought they might be good for trading on the trail." He frowned. "I don't have room for 2 trunks in the wagon. Only one. You'll need to take fewer things to trade." "But I had to work hard to only bring 2 chests. I wanted to bring 4, but Mother said 2 was more than enough." "I agree with your mother. It's more than enough. You're going to have to get it down to 1 trunk and another crate. Nothing more." "What?" "But I don't want to leave all of my special things." Hannah quit walking and dropped his arm, determined to win this first argument with her new husband. He needed to know she wouldn't capitulate, simply because he was a man and he said so. "Are you saying you won't leave more?" he asked, shocked that his sweet-tempered wife was digging in her heels so quickly. "Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. I don't want to leave my things, so I won't. It's that simple." She wasn't going to budge from her spot on the boardwalk without his agreement. "You can't be defying me. We've been married only a few minutes and already you don't think you need to obey me? If you wanted obedience, you should have married a dog. I'm far from obedient. I have a mind of my own." He stood there, looking at her for a moment. "I'll let you keep most of your things, but our wagon simply can't carry as much weight as you're talking about. You could bring the things in the trunk, without bringing the trunk, and that would work beautifully." She shook her head. "No, I want my things protected by the trunk. What if we put some of your things in an oilcloth bag? That would protect them from any damage, and you could still bring them, just not with the weight of a trunk." She considered it for a moment and finally nodded. Yes, that should work nicely. Thank you for working out a compromise with me. I hope you know I won't always be able to compromise that way. You will need to be obedient for the most part. My mother is obedient to Mr. Gatlin, and she seems to have lost herself in that obedience. Where there used to be a woman who would laugh and joke and have fun, now there is this meek little thing that responds to everything her husband wants and needs. He looked at her for a moment, thinking about what she'd said. He'd noticed her mother didn't speak much. I don't want you to be that way. I just don't want you to try to argue with everything I say either. I'll do my best not to argue. I really will. But I think we should discuss things like rational adults instead of you just telling me how things are going to be. Why would I want to be tied to a man who thought he could think for me and run my life for me? He nodded. I understand what you're saying. Shall we continue? He offered her his arm, and they walked the rest of the way to the campground in silence. I'll introduce you to Captain Bedwell this evening. I've already told him that you'll be joining our wagon train. Good. That will make things easier, won't it? Hannah stopped in the middle of the circle of wagons. If everyone is ready to go, why aren't we leaving until Monday? There are many theories on the best time to start out for Oregon, and this particular wagon master thinks that April 1st is the best time, so we're waiting until Monday to go, which is still a few days before the 1st, but since he hopes to stop every Sunday for worship, clothes washing, and to rest the animals, he wanted to start out a few days early rather than late. Does the month you leave in really matter that much? I've seen people leave as late as June. And some think June is better, but if we leave in June, there's no way we'll reach Oregon before snows fly. It makes sense to leave around the 1st of April to me. She shrugged. I guess that I don't have a real opinion on the matter. Would you be willing to go to my mother's house for supper on Sunday before we go? She'll want to see me one last time, if possible. We could always sleep there until we leave as well. No, I need to be with my wagon, and as my wife, you need to be with me. He walked toward Captain Bedwell's wagon to introduce her, hoping she wouldn't try and pick a fight with him again. She seemed to be a normal redhead, one who would argue just for the sake of arguing. The captain, his wife, and 2 sons were all sitting around their campfire. His wife looked a bit peaked, and they hadn't even started the journey yet. He could tell the woman wasn't going to do well on such an arduous journey. He promised himself he'd add her to his prayer journal that very evening. Captain Bedwell. I want to present to you my wife, Hannah Scott. Hannah wanted to wrinkle her nose at the name, but she was able to control her reactions. It didn't seem fair to her that a woman gave up her identity to join with a man, yet he gave up nothing. It's nice to meet you, Captain. And you, Mrs. Scott. The pastor here told me just last night he was getting married, and we're happy to have you along. He smiled a bit. My wife is happy for every woman who joins the wagon train. She has been fretting for months that she would be the only one. Hannah squatted down beside the older woman. It's good to have other women along for me as well, Mrs. Bedwell. Are you feeling ill this evening? Mrs. Bedwell frowned. I've never been in the best of health. I'm just feeling a bit poorly because of all the time we're spending outside. I can understand that. I guess it's part of life on the trail, though, isn't it? Hannah promised herself she'd look out for this woman. She just didn't seem up to the journey. Captain Bedwell laughed, a loud booming laugh that startled Hannah for just a moment. She's a lot stronger than she looks. She's going to do just fine on the trail. You'll see. I hope you're right, Captain. Inside, Hannah was angry with the man for dragging a timid, sickly woman along with him. He certainly hadn't given her a choice, and that wasn't fair at all. Why did men think they had the right to run women's lives without them saying yes or no? It simply made her ready to scream. Jedediah was already starting to be able to tell when Hannah was upset about something, and he knew she didn't approve of the captain dragging his wife along the trail with him. He smiled sweetly at his wife. "Let's go get your trunk, my dear." It seemed strange to Hannah to hear the endearment from him, but she wasn't about to argue. No, instead she'd go along meekly, since they were around people they would know. She would tell him exactly how she felt about the situation, but not until there was no one around to listen. She wouldn't bring him shame with her forward-thinking ways, but she wasn't about to let people be mistreated without her husband getting an earful at the very least. As they walked to their wagon, she was very quiet, trying to think of just the right words to tell him how she felt about things. When they got into the wagon and drove away from camp, her words were freed, and she no longer tried to swallow them. "I don't think Captain Bedwell should be trying to take a sickly wife on the trail with him, do you? I feel deep down inside that it's the wrong thing for her, but he doesn't seem to care. Isn't he the man who agreed to love, honor, and cherish her as long as they both shall live?" Jedediah took a deep breath. "I could tell exactly what you were thinking while we were at their campfire. Thank you for not saying anything in front of them. It wouldn't have gone well. I knew it wouldn't, and I wouldn't shame you that way. I just think he's a horrible person for the way he treats her, and he should be flogged. There. Now I feel better for having spoken my mind. Don't you feel better knowing that I'm not hiding my feelings from you?" He grinned. "You are a typical redhead, aren't you? And what exactly is that supposed to mean? That redheads have tempers?" "Well, yes, I do have a temper, and I'm not ashamed of it in any way." She crossed her arms over her chest and looked away from him. "Speaking of my temper, I think your name is too long, and I'd like to shorten it to Jed. Would you be amenable to that?" He chuckled softly. "I grew up being called Jed, so the name would be just fine. It's much easier to spell as well." She nodded. "I'm going to be keeping a journal of our travels. Mother gifted me a journal that she bought right after marrying my father, but she never got around to writing in it. I'd like to gift it to her children someday and have it filled so they could know how their parents' life was before they came around." He nodded. "I'm keeping a journal of the trail as well. It won't hurt if we both keep one. It won't hurt one lick. I'm glad you agree. I'll start writing in mine tonight. I started mine when I left Illinois. I went to school there and spent a month at home with my family, and then left for independence. My professors told us that there was a huge need for pastors out west, so that's where I'm going. West. And as your semi-obedient wife, I'll go with you. Just don't expect me to pander to your every mood or act like I hang on your every word." Hannah shook her head. "When my mother started doing that with Mr. Gatlin, I was certain I'd vomit any moment." He chuckled softly and stopped the wagon in front of her parents' house. He knew now that he hadn't found himself an obedient wife, but he had found a spirited one. He wasn't sure which was better just yet, but he couldn't complain about the wife he had. She certainly seemed more suited for the trail than Mrs. Bedwell. When they walked into her mother's home, she called out, "Mother, I need help." Her mother was there in an instant. "What do you need?" "Jed says I'm not allowed to take 2 trunks. I can take one packed trunk and I can put the things from the other trunk in an oilcloth bag." "I see. Well, I have an oilcloth bag that I use for transporting food to women who have recently given birth. I'm happy to give it to you. Let's pack up the bag." Mrs. Gatlin hurried off and came back with a large ugly bag, while Hannah dropped to her knees and opened one of her trunks. She quickly began removing things that would go into the bag, and put them in while her mother held the bag open. What had taken them hours to painstakingly pack now only took minutes as they shoved everything into the bag. "You'll stay for supper?" Mrs. Gatlin asked as they finished with the bag and she tied it closed at the top. "No, but thank you, Mrs. Gatlin." Hannah would like to return for supper on Sunday evening so she can say goodbye. Until then, we'll eat at the camp with the others in the wagon train. We're all getting to know one another, and it wouldn't be good if we weren't part of the time before the trail. We'll meet each other once the wagons roll out, so we'll want friends. Jed explained quickly why they couldn't stay. It was as much so he could spend time alone with his new wife as anything else, though. He hoisted the trunk onto his shoulder, and Hannah put the bag over hers. "I'll see you on Sunday," Hannah said with a bright smile as she followed her husband out of the house. Life was getting strange very quickly. Soon, she'd be on the road with only the others in the wagon train for companionship. Hopefully there would be someone near her age she could quickly become friends with. She'd make it happen. Soon. Chapter 3. That evening, they had a small party at camp. One of the men Hannah hadn't met yet, James Pruitt, who went by Jamie, got his guitar out and played. Malcolm Bentley, a blacksmith going west to seek his fortune, immediately got his fiddle, and he played with Jamie. The two of them had obviously played together once or twice, because their music meshed nicely. As soon as the music started, Jed held his hand out to Hannah. "Would you care to dance?" They'd already stowed Hannah's things in the wagon, and Hannah had made her first supper over a campfire. She felt like it was an utter disaster, though Jed had eaten every bite and asked for more. He said he was used to his own cooking and very happy to eat something that wasn't burnt for a change. She smiled and nodded. She'd always loved to dance, though her stepfather had decided it was wicked, and she hadn't been allowed to dance at all in the year that he'd been married to her mother. "I would enjoy that." Hannah went into his arms, and he danced her around the campfire to a wild, rambunctious tune. At the end of the dance, she had a stitch in her side and laughter on her lips. "That was fun, but I'm afraid I already need to sit down for a moment. I wasn't expecting such a wild dance." He smiled, taking her over to the tree stump she'd been using as a chair. "They've played music every night for the past week as we've camped here. Sometimes people will pull out a deck of cards and play games. It's truly been a fun experience. I'm glad you told me we had to stay here then. I'm excited to know all the others we'll be traveling with. I hope we can make some lifelong friends on this journey of ours. I'm not great at meeting people, though, so I might need your help." Jed grinned, sitting on the ground next to her stump. "I think Mary Mitchell is about your age. She's accompanying her parents and younger siblings on the trail." He pointed in the direction of a young woman who was sitting with a large group of children. "She's the eldest of 7 or 8. I'm not sure which." "Wow. I cannot imagine having so many siblings I was traveling with. Please tell me they brought more than one wagon." He nodded. "There was a young man wanting to go west, Bob Hastings, and he's driving their second wagon. I'm not sure what the financial arrangement is between them, but a lot of families will hire someone to drive a second wagon, but they pay them in food." She shook her head. "I can't believe I've lived in independence my entire life, and I never knew any of the things you know about the trail. You had no reason to learn them. I wanted to know exactly what I was getting into." He shrugged. "Our wagon train is going to try to stop every Sunday, and I'm going to preach Sunday services." "Oh. I didn't think we'd be able to have church on the trail. I'm thankful you're here." She smiled at him. "Well, since you're the only reason I'm going, I think I'm thankful you're here for that too." She felt a strange need to flirt with him, as she'd seen other girls do with men so often. There was just something about him that was awfully special. He laughed, finding her much prettier when she was smiling that way. "Do you want to go around and have me introduce you to everyone?" He wanted her to be as comfortable in camp as he was. She shook her head. "Not quite yet. We'll have time tomorrow, won't we?" "Plenty of time. I'm thrilled with the time to get to know all the others, and even each other." Once we start on the trail, it's going to be long, hard days. Hannah nodded. Maybe you can spend some time tomorrow, teaching me to drive the team as well. What did you name the oxen? They're work animals. I didn't name them. What? She asked. We need to name them. He shook his head. Next thing I know, you're going to make me name all the other cows. She looked at him with surprise. We have cows? Hannah had always preferred animals to people, and knowing she and her husband had cows was thrilling to her. I'm taking 3 with us to Oregon. A bull and 2 heifers. He sincerely hoped she wasn't going to suggest naming the cows. We do need to name them then. Hannah grinned. I love animals. I had a cat before my mother remarried. Mr. Gatlin said Mr. Whiskers made him sneeze, and I had to find him a new home. It broke my heart. Jed shook his head. I'm sorry you lost your cat. Hopefully, if he grabbed onto that part of the conversation, she wouldn't still talk about naming the work animals. So tomorrow, I'm going to need to meet all the animals. I want to name them all. Since you haven't done so, I'm going to claim the privilege for myself. Someone who named a cat Mr. Whiskers doesn't need to be naming other critters, he mumbled. I heard that, she said, glaring at him. Mr. Whiskers was a perfectly good name. I refuse to believe otherwise. He groaned. Please don't make me drive a wagon pulled by Mr. Smart Hoofs and his wife, Mrs. Smart Hoofs. She giggled. I kind of like those names. Do we have a boy ox and a girl ox? He simply shook his head. The woman knew nothing about farm life, and it was already obvious. I'll introduce you to all of the animals tomorrow, and we'll make some decisions then. And he suddenly had an idea for the perfect gift for his new wife. He wouldn't say anything, because he might not have time to make it work, but he would try. We have 2 days before we leave. We'll spend a little time tomorrow teaching you to drive the wagon, and we'll make sure you can find all the supplies easily. Are you a coffee drinker? He asked. She nodded. Yes, I like to sip on it all day, warm or cold. Good. Rumor has it that people who drink coffee tend not to get as sick on the trail. I have no idea if it's true, but I'm certainly willing to drink only coffee if it'll make it more likely for us to reach our destination. I wonder why. Hannah had heard the same thing said, but she had never been able to fathom what the difference was. What miracle was in the coffee bean to keep people living longer? Whatever it was, she would drink coffee and nothing else on their journey. Are you close to ready for bed? He asked. He hadn't been paying much attention, but the camp was quiet now, and people were bedding down for the night. I need to write in my journal, and then yes, I'll be ready. She hurried to the wagon and climbed in the back, opening her trunk and removing her journal, an inkwell and pen. Using her trunk as a chair, she opened the journal in her lap, dipped her pen in the ink, and began writing. March 26, 1852. I married today. My groom is Jedediah Scott, a preacher. I've decided to call him Jed, because Jedediah is such a mouthful. Our wedding was arranged by my stepfather, Mr. Gatlin. At first, I was very upset at the prospect of marrying a stranger and being expected to travel the Oregon Trail with him, but now I'm excited for the adventure of it all. Jed is a kind, caring man, who knows that I will never blindly obey him, and he seems content with that. I have no desire to turn into my mother, someone who has been completely cowed by her husband. Tonight, we sat in camp, dancing to the music played by Jamie Pruitt, guitar, and Malcolm Bentley, fiddle. Both are bachelors headed for new lives in the Oregon Territory. We leave Monday for this amazing journey, and we are thankful for the opportunity. I'm a little nervous, but I plan to be as careful as I can. I look forward to getting to know my new husband and all of the adventures we will encounter for the rest of our days. After finishing her quick journal entry, she looked around her. Were they supposed to sleep in the wagon or on the ground outside? Suddenly, she missed her bed a great deal more than she'd imagined she would. Digging in her trunk again, she pulled out a blanket, a quilt, and a pillow. She noticed that Jed had set up a small tent, and he was spreading his own bedding on the ground inside it, and that seemed logical for her. No one seemed to be worrying about wearing a nightgown, so she quickly changed into a simple calico day dress her mother had made for her when she'd volunteered at the local orphanage in town, and she got down out of the wagon and laid out her bedding. She put her bedding close to Jed's, wanting to save him the shame of not sleeping close to his wife on their wedding night. She was not willing to participate in the marriage act with him, especially not with so many people around, but she wouldn't hurt his pride if she could at all help it. As she lay on the grass, she shivered a little, and Jed raised his head. "Are you cold?" She nodded. "I know we're close to the fire, but it's freezing." He lifted one side of his blanket. "Keep your covers, but lay them over mine. Then we can share body heat. I think we'll be too cold otherwise." It was nice during the days, but at night, the weather got below freezing. He'd been dealing with it alone, but having someone to share body heat with sounded downright wonderful. Hannah did as he asked, and moved toward him, covering him with the blankets she had brought as well as sliding under his with him. She had her arms clutched in front of her, trying to preserve her body heat as she shivered. "Move your arms," he said, "down to your sides. If we lie with your back to me, we can share heat and be nice and warm." She nodded, doing as she was told and rolling toward him. It felt strange to be held that way by a man she barely knew, or by anyone, for that matter, but he was her husband, and she was cold. She wasn't going to worry about what they should be doing. No, she was going to be as warm as she could be. Hannah's body warmed quickly, and she began to drift off to sleep, the feel of his arms around her making her feel protected. She could sleep that way for the rest of her life without complaint, and she just might do that. Jed lay awake for a long while after her breathing had grown steady and she'd fallen asleep. He was surprised by how she'd acted that day. She seemed very different than she had the previous evening, but she seemed better. He didn't like that she hadn't obeyed his every command, but she was obviously very strong-willed, and he didn't see that as a bad thing. He finally closed his eyes with a silent prayer to his Maker. "Thank you for sending this woman into my life. I already feel like everything I do is more meaningful with her beside me." He buried his face in her hair and finally drifted off to sleep. His new wife was something special, and he would work hard to treat her as such. Asterisk. Hannah woke up to the sound of gunshots the following morning and quickly became aware of the chill in the air around her. She must have fallen asleep with her window open again. As she stretched, she became very aware of a body behind hers, a very masculine body. Then it came to her. She was married, and she'd be sleeping outside for the next 6 months or so. It was going to be a very long journey. She slipped out from under the cover and walked to the wagon, pulling a shawl over her shoulders for comfort. It was still cold in the mornings and at night, which would be part of the difficulty of this journey. She took the stew she'd made for supper the previous night and carried it over to the campfire to heat it up. As she was looking for matches, she heard a voice from behind her. "What are you trying to find?" Hannah turned and smiled at Jed, who was now propped up on one elbow under the blankets. "I'm looking for a match. I know I can't make a new meal every morning, but I thought it would be good to heat up what I made last night." She had thought hard about the best way to conserve her energy with cooking. "We can do that today, but no one is going to wait for us on the trail as we heat up supper for breakfast. We'll have time to eat quickly and make a pot of coffee for us to drink on all day." She sighed. "Cold stew?" He grinned at her. "It could be worse. It could be cold beans." She made a face. "I'll stop complaining." He stood up and his body pressed against hers as he reached in and took the matches out, placing them in her hand. "There you go. I always put them back right there. Hannah flushed as he pressed against her. He'd only kissed her the once, but she was starting to like feeling his body against hers. Probably more than she should. Thank you. I'll start the fire and put the coffee on. As she turned to head back to the fire, he stopped her, leaning down and pressing his lips against hers. Good morning. She blushed and mentally berated herself for it. Everyone knew a redhead was not pretty when she blushed. Good morning. With her head down, she hurried to the fire and set about her morning chores. She couldn't believe it, but she was actually anxious to be on their way. She could already tell how romantic the trail would be, with her and Jed sitting side by side in the evenings, holding hands and talking about their days. As soon as they finished breakfast, he hitched up the wagon. We're going to go have your first driving lesson, he said with a smile. Are you ready? I am. I like the idea of being able to drive the wagon and not have to walk along beside it. He gave her a questioning look. You know that driving will be hard work, right? Well, it can't be nearly as hard as walking, she said. We'll see. He knew she was wrong, but he wasn't ready to tell her so just yet. It would be better if she came to that conclusion herself. There was no doubt in his mind that she'd soon be walking with the other women and the children. Once the team was hitched up, he helped her onto the seat and drove a short way down the road that was the beginning of the trail. Finally, he stopped and handed her the leads, explaining how to drive. If you let the leads go slack, the oxen will know they can go faster. If you make the leads tight, they'll slow down. You want to drive slowly down the hills and over rivers. She swallowed hard. Rivers? Can't we just build a bridge? Jed chuckled softly. It takes months and sometimes years to build a bridge. No, we're going to have to drive across the shallower rivers, and even make canoes to go over some of them. I've heard that a lot of the pioneers will leave their canoes beside the trail, and whoever follows is free to use it. It hasn't been a particularly bad winter, so the rivers aren't very high. We should be able to just float across most of them. This is going to be a lot harder than I'm picturing, isn't it? Hannah asked, shaking her head. I'm not sure if I'm up for this journey. He put his arm around her, pulling her toward him. Of course, you are. You're going to learn a lot, and when you arrive, you'll be much stronger, both mentally and physically. It's not an easy trek, but it's worthwhile. I'll do my very best, she said softly. Now, give the leads a little slack and then start driving. He waited as she did as she was told, ready to take the leads from her at any time. Pull to the right to make them turn. It took every bit of Hannah's strength to be able to keep the oxen in line. By the time they stopped, after a 1-hour lesson, she was aching. I don't think I can drive the wagon. Does that mean I have to walk? She hated the idea of walking, but her arms would never be the same if she tried to drive the wagon. He shrugged. I really don't mind if you ride in the wagon, but I think you'll find you prefer the camaraderie of walking with the other women. The wagon is very bouncy. From what I've been told, we can hang a bucket of milk on the bottom of the wagon, and we'll have butter by noontime. I don't care which you choose, but I think you want to walk. She frowned. I've never walked further than my church. I'm not sure I'll be able to keep up. Jed frowned. Everyone is going to be sore on the trail. We'll be walking between 15 and 20 miles most days. You'll find that you want to walk to be in good shape and to get used to the other women. You need to make friends. Hannah was quiet for a moment as he drove back toward the campground. She'd had very few friends in her life. She was just odd enough that it was hard for her to make friends with other girls. I'll try. You'll do more than try. I'm sure you'll find someone in camp that will become your lifelong friend. Go to one of the other women at lunchtime and ask them how to make biscuits over a fire. They'll be happy to teach you, and you'll get to know them during the process. She sighed. I'm really not ready for this trip, am I? Jed stopped the wagon in the same spot it had been in before. I don't think anyone is really ready for this trip. It's long and difficult. People are being asked to do many things they've never done before, and that's not easy. I think it'll be a tad more difficult for you, because you weren't raised on a farm, doing hard chores every day, but you are just stubborn enough that I'm sure you'll do great. She frowned. Did you really just call me stubborn? What kind of thing is that to say to a new wife? Truthful in this case. I think it's one of my favorite things about you. He got down and came around, catching her around the waist and lifting her down. Go find someone who looks nice and ask her how to make biscuits. We'll eat them a lot on the trail. She nodded, wanting to complain. She'd been taught never to speak to anyone unless she'd been properly introduced, and he wanted her to walk around talking to strangers? Yes, circumstances were different, but it was still hard for her. She walked slowly around the camp and spotted Mary Mitchell, whom Jed had pointed out the previous evening. She walked up to the other girl, noticing a musket leaning against one of the Mitchell's wagons. Miss Mitchell? Hannah said hesitantly. Could you teach me to make biscuits over the fire? The girl nodded. Call me Mary, please. You're the preacher's wife, right? She looked over Hannah's shoulder. Ezra, I told you not to be climbing people's wagons. You're going to get hurt. Turning her focus back to Hannah, she said, sorry. Ma and Pa wandered off to the general store in town, wanting to stock up on a few things. That means I'm in charge of all of my younger siblings, except little Maisie, who is still nursing, so Ma took her along. I am the preacher's wife, Hannah said, feeling odd just saying the words. She'd never dreamed she'd be a preacher's wife. Do you want to go to Oregon? Or are you just going because your parents need help? Mary smiled. Oh, trust me. I want to go. I want to have my own homestead. I'm not allowed to own land anywhere in the East, but I can there. No one can stop me, because women are allowed to own property there, even though they can't here. Hannah smiled. Well, aren't you clever? Do your parents know what your plan is? Are you kidding? Mary asked softly. They'd tie me in a wagon to keep me from going to the deed office, but I just don't care. I want to be able to go where I please, not be tied to a man who will decide my future. That's not fair to anyone. She kept her voice low, and Hannah knew it was so people wouldn't hear what she was saying. A woman who thought like Mary did was not someone anyone wanted to be around. Hannah lowered her voice. I agree. I didn't want to marry at all, but my stepfather decided I needed to marry Jed. If I have to be married to someone, he's a nice man, and I enjoy being around him. Well, that's good at least. Mary was mixing up the dough for the biscuits, and Hannah watched. It seemed to be the same recipe she already had memorized for the treat. My pa has tried to marry me off a few times, but I always remind Ma how unruly the little ones are, and she tells him she can't do without me. Problem solved. Hannah laughed softly. You're devious. Mary grinned. Just a little. Besides, no men back home really wanted to marry me, because I'm better with a musket than just about any man. I can't wait to shoot a buffalo. Do you think we'll really see buffalo? I'm sure we will. They're still roaming everywhere out west. Mary patted out the biscuits and put them into a cast iron skillet. This isn't half what I'd make for my family, but it's about right for you and the pastor. Within minutes, she was pulling the skillet off the fire. There, a perfect biscuit made over a campfire. She carefully removed one from the skillet and handed it to Hannah. Try it. I will. Thank you so much, Mary. And you must call me Hannah. I have a feeling we're going to be good friends. I think so, too. Chapter 4. That first day in camp, Hannah talked to many people, but she kept going back to Mary. There was something about the girl that fascinated her and made her want to get to know her better. Hannah shared the biscuit Mary had made with Jed when she got back to camp, and she made biscuits of her own that turned out just as good as Mary's. "Maybe I can cook over a campfire after all," Hannah told Jed. "I never doubted you for a minute." They ate a meal of the biscuits with jam on them. Jed had purchased jam at the general store before realizing he would be marrying. He wasn't disappointed to have the sweet treat, though. "What did you think of Miss Mitchell? I saw you over there with her, and it seemed like you were enjoying yourself." "I think I've found someone who will be a good friend in Mary. She thinks the same way I do in a lot of ways, but she was raised on a farm, so she knows how to do more things. She told me she can outshoot most men she knows." Jed laughed. "I can see that the two of you would get along well if she can do that. Does she even want to go to Oregon?" Hannah considered telling him Mary's secret for a moment, but she couldn't betray her new friend that way. She had no way of knowing if Jed was friendly with Mary's father. I don't think she really had a choice. Her parents needed help with the children, and she came along to help. "Yeah, I think that's good of her, but I could see her not wanting to do it." He took another sip of coffee. "These are restful days as we make sure we're ready for the trail. Judging by the amount of jam you put on our biscuits, we may need to get a few more jars." Hannah grinned. "I've never denied being fond of sweet things. I have a feeling jam may be the only sweet we get for a while. Then we'll need to walk into town and get some more. It's a long journey." "I like the way you think." He smiled, tracing her cheek with one finger. "I like the way you look when you have a genuine smile on your face. Your whole face lights up from within." "That sounds positively ghastly." "You don't need to tell me you like how I look. I know that I'm not a beautiful girl." He wasn't sure how to respond to her without digging himself a hole for burial. "You're not a traditional beauty, no, but you have aspects that make you prettier than anyone I've ever seen." Hannah shook her head and quickly washed the dishes from their small lunch. "I don't need you to lie to me." "Of course, you don't. And I never would." Jed wasn't going to take back what he'd said, because it was true. There was something awfully special about her. "Would you like to walk to the general store for that jam after you finish with the lunch dishes?" "I would like that a great deal." She wouldn't look at him though. Though his words were flattering, they made her doubt everything he'd said to her. She was anything but pretty. On their walk, she pointed out different sights along the way. Places she'd been and things she'd done. "I've lived in independence my entire life. My father ran the general store before his death. He was shot by someone wanting the money from the cash register. I wish he'd just given it to them. I miss him every single day." "I'm sure you do." "I don't know what I would have done if I'd lost my father. He's the best man I've ever known in my life, and I so want to be like him." Jed wasn't exaggerating either. His father had a passion for both God and farming, and he had a way of combining the two so you didn't know which he loved more. "You understand then. Another man bought the general store from Mother, and he still runs it. It was hard to find a buyer at first, because of the shooting. Someone actually thought Father was haunting the store. I think that's just plain silly, but it still made it hard to sell." They walked into the store, and as she always did when she went in, Hannah looked all around, looking for the personal touches that had been there when her father was alive. "I think we might want another tin cup for the trail." "It was odd having to share one this morning," Jed suggested. Again, Hannah worried about money. "I don't mind sharing." She didn't want to waste all their money before they even left for Oregon. "We can afford another cup, Hannah." He walked to the shelf and pulled down a tin cup before walking over to the few jams they had on sale in one corner of the store. Raspberry? Grape? He asked. Both. Do they have honey? Hannah looked around for a jar of honey. They do. I'll get all 3, but these will have to last us until we get to Oregon. An older woman stopped at their words. Hannah Moseby? Are you going to Oregon? Hannah nodded. Yes, I am, Mrs. Jenkins. This is my husband, Jed Scott. He's a pastor, and he wants to minister to those out west. She was glad she wasn't alone as she faced the old harridan who gossiped about everyone she'd ever met and many she hadn't. I hadn't heard you were getting married. Mrs. Jenkins looked positively shocked that Hannah had found a husband. Hannah resisted the urge to kick the other woman as hard as she could in the shins, but she remembered how much it had embarrassed her mother the last time she'd done it. Jed stepped forward and shook the offered hand. It was fast. I took one look at Hannah, and I knew I couldn't go west without her. He smiled down at Hannah, a goofy grin on his face. Is that so? Mrs. Jenkins looked skeptical. I'll have to hear all about it from your mother. Why, I haven't called on her in ages. Not since. Her voice trailed away as if she was afraid of upsetting Hannah, but Hannah knew the truth. She was trying to get a rise out of Hannah, and she refused to take the bait. Not since my father's death? When she needed her friends the most? Go see her. I'm sure she'll be happy to tell you everything you want to know. Hannah smiled sweetly. Mrs. Jenkins was a woman she frequently wanted to strangle. She walked around the older woman to the counter, where Mr. Hardy was working. Good to see you, Hannah. I heard you married some preacher man and headed out west. Your father was telling everyone. Mr. Hardy punched the keys on his cash register. That's mostly right. I married Jedediah Scott, who is a preacher, but we don't leave for Oregon until Monday. We're at the campground, ready to leave. Well, if that don't beat all. You married to a preacher man and taking off for the West. I know you'll be a great wife, Hannah. Thank you, Mr. Hardy. She'd always liked the man who had once worked for her father. He'd always paid special attention to her. Jed paid for their purchases and carried them out of the store in a small wooden crate. Everyone knows you, he said. And you didn't seem to like that woman who talked to you? She's not a kind person. She's asking about me because she wants to be able to spread as much gossip as she can. I know the type, he said. I'm sorry you had to run into her. He would have stayed between them if he'd known she would be a problem for Hannah. I am too. But I'm happy that I never have to run into her again. Hannah did a little dance step as she walked beside him, and he chuckled loudly. Are we going to church in town tomorrow? She asked. No, I'm preaching at the campground. This will be my first week to preach for all of them. I got here on Saturday, and Sunday I preached for about half of the group, but now everyone is assembled. I'm actually a little nervous about it. Do you want to practice by speaking to me later? I sure wouldn't mind. It wasn't something she'd ever expected, being a preacher's wife, but she was determined to be the best she could possibly be. Maybe. I'll practice it myself first, and then I'll decide. I'm not thrilled with what I've written so far. Jed had never found a sermon quite as difficult as this one. What are you speaking about? He sighed. I thought I'd talk about how we need to be ready to minister to anyone along the way. Why not preach about God providing? Everyone is so nervous about the upcoming trip. A reminder that God will always provide whatever we need seems much more fitting. Matthew chapter 6 would be a great verse to center the sermon around. A slow smile spread across his face. That's brilliant. I needed an idea that I was passionate about, and this is one that fits perfectly with our situation. If my hands weren't full, I'd stop walking and kiss you right here and now. She laughed. I wouldn't stop you. Is that so? He asked. It is so. Maybe we can take a walk around the campground later, and you can demonstrate what you're thinking now. She knew she was being forward, but the man was her husband. If she couldn't be forward with him, who could she be forward with? I'm going to hold you to that, he said, grinning over at her. Do you think we have enough jam now? I sure hope so. Between that and the honey, we should be okay. I don't plan to do any preserving on the trip, so don't even ask me to. Thankfully, Hannah knew how. It was one of the things her mother had insisted on teaching her, despite the fact they'd had a maid and a cook to do those things for them. I wouldn't. We're all going to be exhausted on this journey. I won't ask you to do anything beyond the chores that you'll naturally get. Like cooking, fetching water for meals, and laundry? Like all of those things. I know it seems like a lot, and it will be. I will do my best to keep up my end of the bargain too, and always keep your pots filled with fresh meat. Are you a hunter? She asked. He shrugged. I'm not fabulous at it, but I do enjoy hunting a great deal. I won't try to outshoot Miss Mitchell if that's what you're worried about. She laughed. I hope not. I might ask her to teach me to hunt. I think I could be good at it if I tried. She'd found herself good at most everything she tried. That's why she was so drawn to Mary. As far as she could see, they were very similar people. That wouldn't bother me at all, but you might want to have her do it today or tomorrow. There isn't going to be a lot of time for shooting lessons once we're on the trail. I might just do that. I really like her. I hope you're right, and she and I become lifelong friends. We could settle near each other, and our children could play together. You know that most likely after we reach Oregon, we won't see the people in our wagon train again, right? I know that, but let me keep my delusions. I don't want to have to think about making new friends again once we reach our ultimate destination. I want to imagine taking the friends I'm making now all through life with me. Jed smiled. I'm not one to keep you from imagining whatever you want to imagine. They had reached the campground, and they walked over to put the new goods in the back of the wagon. I don't think anything else is going to fit, so I hope you have everything you want here. I'll make it fit if I need something else, she said with a smile. I'm going to go over and talk Mary into teaching me to use a musket. I might bring in supper tonight. Jed watched her go, noting the jauntiness of her step. She was so much happier now that he'd gotten her away from her stepfather. He got out some paper, and he started to write out the new sermon she'd challenged him to write. It was going to be so much better than what he'd planned to say. Hannah hurried off to convince Mary to teach her to shoot, and she found her new friend looking frustrated. Are you all right? Mary nodded. Yes, I'm fine. I'm about to take a walk to cool my head. Do you mind if I come with you? I was hoping you could teach me to shoot, but if it's a bad time. Mary grinned. I'll make you a deal. I'll teach you to shoot if you'll teach me to fix my hair like you had yours yesterday. It was so beautiful. I would love to teach you. It's super easy, though my mother did it for me yesterday, because she wanted to fix my hair for my wedding. She said she'd been dreaming about how she'd fix it since I was a little girl. Sounds like a mother, Mary said with a grin. All right, I'm going to let Maud know what I'm doing, and that she's in charge of her own kids for a change. A moment later Mary was back, and her musket was slung over one shoulder, with her 2 pouches of powder over her chest. She had a 3rd pouch full of the balls that she would shoot. The hardest part of using a musket, in my opinion, is simply loading it. Pointing and shooting are easy. I rarely miss, and only then if it's a moving target and I'm somewhat distracted. I cannot tell you how much I love being able to outshoot men around me. Hannah laughed softly. I know I'd enjoy it too, if I could do it. I want to bring in supper tonight. Is there any chance I could do that? Sure. We're far enough away from town that we see deer regularly here. If not deer, we'll at least see a rabbit, and you could shoot that and take it back to camp. Sounds good to me. Though Hannah had never learned to shoot, she was very good at spotting animals, and she hoped it would help. They weren't even half a mile from camp when Hannah pointed off to their right. A buck was standing there sniffing the air as if he was trying to find danger. Mary adeptly loaded the musket and pointed it at the deer, demonstrating for Hannah. Then she helped her friend hoist the gun, which was a great deal heavier than Hannah had expected, to her shoulder and showed her how to shoot. Hannah carefully steadied the musket and closed one eye, trying to be sure she could see the buck. The recoil of the gun knocked her on her backside. She couldn't even tell if she'd hit the buck. You got him. He's lame now. I'll take the musket back and finish him. Good job. This time, when Mary reloaded the musket, Hannah watched more carefully, determined she was going to be able to shoot. What if a bear came along while Jed was busy with something else? It would be up to her to protect herself. Mary finished off the deer, and the two young ladies ran toward it. I can't believe I shot something on my first try, Hannah said, excited. I can't either. That was really good. Getting him in the hind quarter where you did was perfect, because it slowed him so I could shoot him. I was shooting for his head, Hannah said ruefully. She refused to not be elated though. She was bringing supper in with her friend. When they reached the deer, Mary pulled a knife from her cleavage and proceeded to bind its legs with some rope she'd tucked into the ankle of her shoe. What else do you have hidden on you? Hannah asked. She had never seen a lady able to carry so much. Lots. I always have a knife in my boot. I keep ropes in various places. I'm not going to be caught unprepared. I sew pockets into all my clothes. I need to be able to get the things I need when I need them. Mary sighed heavily. You must think me odd, being able to shoot the way I do. My parents had me, and it wasn't until 8 years later that my next oldest sibling was born. I'm 20, and he's only 12. So, my father taught me many of the things he would have taught a son, had one been born first. Now my parents both think I should become a shy retiring lady who only cooks and never hunts, but I've told them it's too late. I'm a hunter through and through. Together, the two girls dragged the deer back to camp. I probably should have sent you back for someone with a horse, Mary said, but it's just easier this way. I don't mind doing the work of pulling him back if you don't. I don't mind at all. Hannah's arms were already aching from driving that morning, but she wasn't about to complain. She felt as if she was doing something real by working side by side with her friend. We need to hang the deer in a tree for a bit to let it bleed out, but I'll show you how to get a good roast out of it. You can cook your man a fine meal tonight, and I'll give some to my mother to cook. I'm not fond of cooking, and she is, so we usually divide the chores with me taking on the little ones, and she does the cooking. We do the laundry together, though I'd love to find a way to get out of doing my share of that. It's going to be awful on the trail when we have to tote water for it. Why will we tote water? Wouldn't it be easier just to do the wash at a river or spring? Whatever we find, of course. That's a good point. My ma probably will think it's being lazy about our duties, but I think it's conserving energy for things we really need it for. Like walking beside those blasted wagons all day. I had to walk here from northern Missouri, and I hated it. Especially having to keep the children calm and walking. I thought I was going to be able to drive the wagon, but I've realized there's no way on earth I can do that. My arms and shoulders are so sore from even trying this morning. Jed took me out and taught me to drive the team, but it was bad. I can understand that. Mary shrugged. You can walk with me, and help me keep the hellions in line. She grinned at Hannah. But my mother can never know I called them that. Hannah laughed. My lips are sealed. I didn't even tell Jed that you planned to get your own homestead when we got to Oregon City. I didn't want to betray your confidence. Thank you for that, though I wouldn't have minded if you'd told Jed. As they stepped into camp, people spotted them. Mary's father came walking over, shaking his head. You always have to show everyone what you can do, don't you? I was happy to get supper for the family tonight, Pa. My friend Hannah shot him first, and I just finished him off. Well, let me help you with it, Mr. Mitchell said. Hannah could see both pride and confusion on the man's face. As if he wanted to be proud, but it just didn't seem right that Mary could do what she did. I'm going to go tell Jed I shot our supper, Hannah said with a grin. Do I need to help hanging it from the tree? Oh, no, Mary said. Pa and I will handle it. We've done this together 100 times over the years. You really shouldn't go bragging about your boyish ways, Mary. Mr. Mitchell shook his head. Hannah hurried away before she could hear her friend's answer to her father. She didn't understand why the man wasn't prouder of Mary than he was. He didn't have to hunt or fish for supper, because Mary had already done it. Of course, her father had been proud of anything she could do. She almost felt badly for Mary, but then she remembered her friend was going to have a homestead all to herself. When she got back to the wagon, she found Jed sitting on the tree stump she'd been using for a chair. How's the sermon coming? She asked. I'm almost finished, and I don't need to read it to you. I know it's what I need to say. Thank you so much for helping me with it. Hannah shook her head. I didn't do anything but suggest a passage and a topic. You did all the real work. And I shot supper. He grinned at her. I saw you and Miss Mitchell dragging a deer into camp. You shot it? Hannah nodded. I was aiming for the head, and I hit its hind quarters instead, but I slowed it down enough for Mary to finish it. We're sharing the meat with them. That sounds very fair. Did you enjoy shooting? He asked. That musket knocked me on my backside, Hannah said with a laugh. But I could do it myself now, and I think that's what's important. I want to be able to protect myself when you're not around. He nodded. I will feel much safer leaving you alone if you can. She stretched her arms above her head, grinning. I feel like I've learned a lot today. I can shoot a musket, and I can drive a team of oxen when absolutely necessary. And I can make biscuits over a campfire. You are so much more useful to me than you were yesterday, he said. The twinkle in his eye told her he was teasing, and she laughed along with him. When you can preach a sermon, it will be time for me to just give up entirely. That's never going to happen, she said. I wouldn't want it to happen even if it could. She had no desire to speak in front of people. I think you'd be better at it than you care to admit. You're afraid I'll put you to work doing my job for me. Not at all. She sighed, sitting down on the ground and spreading her skirts around her, to carefully not allow any of her underclothes to be seen. What will we do after supper tonight? Already she was looking forward to spending time with him, and the trail seemed a little more exciting by the minute. Sure, she knew there was a great deal of hard work ahead of her, but she was going to do it, because she refused to fail. I thought we might seek out another married couple to play cards tonight. Would you like that? Hannah nodded, wishing her new friend were married. Do only married couples play cards? Oh, not at all. I know that Mary Mitchell and Bob Hastings will sometimes pair up for some of the games. I just watched those nights, because I didn't have a partner, but now that I have one, they would be fun to play with. Do you think there's some kind of romance going on between Bob and Mary? She asked. She had thought so before talking to Mary so much, but now she was unsure. I don't. If there is something, it's all one-sided. Bob seems to be infatuated with her, but she has no interest in him at all. You can see it in her eyes. She's happy with what she does, and she doesn't really want to marry yet. When I first got to camp, I briefly considered courting her, but I could tell she wasn't interested at all. Hannah felt a surprising pang of jealousy for her friend. Would you have rather married Mary then? Not at all. I married the woman I wanted to marry. I wouldn't have married you after meeting you if I hadn't wanted to. You are the right woman. I can feel it. God led me to you. Hannah smiled. I hope you're right. She couldn't imagine God wanting a preacher to marry her, but if he thought so, she wasn't going to argue with him. I know I am.